Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're bringing you some breaking news and discoveries. To keep you ahead of the curve, we'll be diving into a FOC X weather update, covering some major events impacting the U.S. and beyond.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how these seemingly separate events, like ice storms, atmospheric rivers, earthquakes, actually reveal a lot about the interconnectedness of our planet's systems.
Okay, so let's give our listener a quick overview of what we're dealing with. First, we have a major ice storm brewing that could impact travel from Chicago all the way to Boston. Then the West Coast is bracing for yet another round of those intense atmospheric rivers, raising concerns about flooding and landslides. And as if that wasn't enough, we've also got earthquake swarms shaking the Greek island of Santorini.
And what's particularly interesting about the Santorini situation is that it's a volcanic island. You know, already a hotbed of geological activity. These swarms could potentially signal something bigger brewing beneath the surface.
Wow. So we've got ice, rain, and potential earthquakes. But before we get into all that, we've got a bonus topic that's sure to brighten your day. Endangered frogs taking a 7,000-mile journey, with the dads carrying the babies.
It's a heartwarming story of survival and conservation. That's worth exploring. But first, let's unpack these potentially dangerous weather events. Let's start with this ice storm threat in the U.S. The FOX weather report paints a pretty serious picture, with millions on alert for power outages and hazardous travel conditions across a huge swath of the country, from the Midwest to the Northeast.
You know, when I hear about an ice storm of this magnitude, it really makes me think about how important it is to be prepared. What kind of impact could this have on people's daily lives?
Well, imagine roads coated in the thick layer of ice. Even a short commute could become treacherous. And the Thursday morning rush hour from Chicago to Boston is being flagged as particularly dangerous. And with the potential for power outages, people could be facing disruptions to heating, cooking, and even access to essential services.
So for anyone listening who has travel plans in those areas, now is the time to check for alerts and consider alternatives. Don't wait until you're stuck in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. But why exactly are we expecting freezing rain? What's causing this specific weather pattern?
It all comes down to the way different air masses are interacting. In this case, we have warm air moving in above a shallow layer of freezing air near the ground. When precipitation falls through this warm layer, it melts into rain. But then it encounters that freezing layer close to the ground. The result, it freezes on contact, creating that treacherous coating of ice on everything from roads and power lines to trees and cars.
That makes sense, and it really highlights how a seemingly small difference in temperature can have a huge impact. Okay, so we've got the ice storm on the East Coast, but the West Coast isn't out of the woods yet either. Those atmospheric rivers just keep on coming. And the FOX weather update says this latest one could bring even more flooding.
Yes, and the concern here is that the ground is already saturated from the previous storms. Any additional rainfall significantly increases the risk of flooding and landslides. The FOX Forecast Center is even predicting rainfall rates could reach ½ an inch per hour in Northern California.
½ an inch per hour. That's a staggering amount of rain in such a short time. I can only imagine the kind of impact that could have on communities that are already struggling with the aftermath of the previous storms.
Exactly. We're talking about potential damage to homes and businesses, disruptions to transportation and infrastructure, and even risks to human life. And while we can't attribute any specific weather event to climate change, it's important to remember that scientists have been warning us about the increasing frequency and intensity of these kinds of extreme weather events.
It's a sobering reminder that we need to take climate change seriously and work towards solutions. But let's move on now from rain to something a little more shaky. The FOX weather update also mentioned an earthquake swarm happening in Santorini. What can you tell us about that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Santorini is a volcanic island, which means it's already geologically active. But these earthquake swarms, which are clusters of quakes happening in a relatively short period, can sometimes be precursors to a larger earthquake.
So it's a situation that requires close monitoring. What exactly causes these earthquake swarms? And how do scientists determine if they're a sign of something bigger to come?
Earthquake swarms typically occur in areas with active fault lines or volcanic activity. In Santorini's case, you have both. The movement of magma beneath the surface, along with the shifting of tectonic plates, can trigger these swarms. Scientists monitor the frequency, magnitude, and location of these quakes to try and determine if they are part of a pattern that might indicate a larger event is imminent.
It must be nerve-wracking for the people who live on Santorini, knowing that the ground beneath their feet could shift at any moment.
Absolutely. The human element is so important to consider in these situations. Imagine living in a paradise like Santorini, but always having that underlying awareness of the island's volatile nature.
Okay, so we've covered ice, we've covered rain, we've covered earthquakes. Now, let's shifting of making a difference. Earlier we talked about those earthquake swarms in Santorini. I'm curious, what can people do to prepare for an earthquake, especially in a region that's known to be seismically active?
Well, the first step is awareness. Understanding the risks and potential consequences of an earthquake is crucial. Having a plan in place is also essential. This includes knowing safe places to take cover during shaking, having emergency supplies on hand, and establishing communication protocols with family members.
So it's all about being prepared, just like with the ice storm threat we discussed earlier.
Precisely. And it's not just about individual preparedness, but also about community resilience. Building codes and infrastructure need to be designed with seismic activity in mind, and communities need to have systems in place for responding to and recovering from earthquakes.
That makes sense. But let's go back to those Darwin's frogs for a moment. You mentioned that the chytrid fungus is devastating amphibian populations around the world. What can you tell us about this fungus, and why is it so deadly to frogs?
Chytrid is a type of fungus that attacks the skin of amphibians. What makes it so dangerous is that amphibians rely on their skin for respiration and water regulation. When the fungus infects their skin, it disrupts these crucial processes, essentially suffocating the animal.
That's horrifying. What's being done to combat this fungus and protect amphibian populations?
Scientists are working on a variety of approaches, including developing antifungal treatments, researching the fungus's biology to identify potential weaknesses, and exploring ways to boost amphibian immunity. There's also a focus on biosecurity measures to prevent the spread of the fungus to new areas.
So it's a multi-pronged approach involving research, conservation, and international collaboration.
Yes. And it highlights the importance of a global perspective. When tackling environmental challenges, what affects one part of the world can quickly spread and have devastating consequences elsewhere.
You know, it's fascinating how these seemingly disparate stories, an ice storm in the US, earthquake swarms in Greece, endangered frogs traveling across continents, all connect back to this idea of the interconnectedness of our planet.
Absolutely. We live in a complex, dynamic system, and understanding these connections is crucial for navigating the challenges we face.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to touch on something that really struck me about the Darwin's frog story. It's the sheer dedication of those male frogs. I mean, carrying those fertilized eggs in their vocal sacs for weeks on end, that's commitment. It makes you wonder if there are any parallels in the human world.
Well, you could argue that carrying a child for 9 months is a form of dedication on a similar scale. And from a broader perspective, the efforts of conservationists to protect these frogs and countless other species demonstrate a deep commitment to preserving biodiversity for future generations.
That's a great point. It really highlights how interconnected we are with the natural world and how our actions can have a ripple effect. But let's bring it back to listener for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground today, from ice storms to earthquakes to froggy fathers. What do you think are the most important takeaways for our listener?
I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of awareness and preparedness. Whether it's staying informed about weather events, understanding the risks of natural disasters, or being mindful of our impact on the environment. Knowledge is key to making informed decisions and taking appropriate actions.
Absolutely. And with the ice storm potentially hitting the East Coast soon, it's a good reminder to check those travel plans, make sure you have emergency supplies on hand, and prioritize safety above all else.
And for those on the West Coast, remember, those atmospheric rivers are still a threat. Be mindful of the potential for flooding and landslides, and stay informed about evacuation orders or other safety recommendations from local authorities.
Okay, so be prepared, stay informed, and prioritize safety. Those are great takeaways. But before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the interconnectedness of our planet. We've seen this theme play out in all the stories we've discussed today. How can our listener apply this idea of interconnectedness to their own life?
It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences both locally and globally. The choices we make as individuals, from what we consume to how we travel, can have a ripple effect on the environment and on communities around the world.
So it's about making conscious choices that minimize our negative impact and contribute to a more sustainable future.
Exactly, and it's not about being perfect, but about being mindful and making gradual changes where we can supporting sustainable businesses, reducing our carbon footprint, advocating for environmental protection. These are all steps in the right direction.
That's a great message to end on, but before we go, I have one final thought-provoking question for a listener. We've seen the power of nature in both destructive and inspiring ways today. What role do you think humans play in understanding and mitigating the risks of natural disasters while also protecting the wonders of the natural world?
It's a complex question with no easy answers,
Uh,
but I think it boils down to finding a balance between respecting the power of nature and harnessing our own ingenuity to create a more sustainable and resilient future.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery and reflection. We hope you've learned something new and are feeling inspired to engage with the world around you in a meaningful way. Until next time, stay curious.